Transmitter device activated. Coordinates set for Earth 2.
Hello and welcome to the Earth 2 podcast, the weekly podcast in which we navigate the pre-crisis DC Comics multiverse and examine the legacy of its Golden Age characters throughout the Silver and Bronze Ages of comics. I'm Steve Higgins.
And I'm David Steele. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. We have reached the end, not of the podcast, but of the Spectre's adventures in Adventure Comics. Today, Steve and I have reassembled to cover Adventure 439 and Adventure 440. We shall start with 439, which was published on the 27th of February 1975, not long before my second birthday. And Steve will now tell us about the cover.
This is a great cover, one of my favorites, I think, of the whole run. We have the Line of DC Superstars logo up in the top left. We have 25 cents, number 439, June, in a circle on the top right. In between the two, on the banner at the top, it says, "The Voice That Doomed the Spectre." And we have the Adventure Comics logo with the background in red and the words Adventure Comics written in yellow. As always, somehow approved by the Comics Code Authority. The cover image itself, down at the bottom of the page, is a man in blue overalls, white shirt, firing a machine gun wildly into the air because the Spectre is appearing out of smoke, coming from the ground and swooping up into the air, and he's looming large over this man who's firing at the Spectre with his machine gun, and the bullets are just passing through the Spectre. And the Spectre is doing all of this because Gwen Sterling, our romantic love interest, is tied up, laying on the ground. She's wearing a yellow outfit, yellow pants, but yellow and orange striped, vertical striped shirt. And she's obviously in great distress, but very glad to see the Spectre there rescuing her. Very striking image.
It's quite a simple, straightforward one, isn't it? Very effective.
Yes, indeed.
So into the comic properly, our opening splash image. Well, the Spectre is looming up again. And Gwen is lying tied up in ropes again, and she's gasping because in front of her we can see three people. There's a black man with a moustache, a blonde lady, and another chap with sort of auburn-coloured hair, all wearing sort of purple dungarees over blue shirts, or maybe overalls is probably the more appropriate word. And they're all sort of, they're all being trapped by, it looks like, three separate snakes. They're all sort of coiled up and getting strangled and throttled, and Gwen is gasping at this, and it's very, very effective. We have the usual scene-setting caption.
"In the world of mortal men, he is Jim Corrigan, hard-boiled police detective. But to the vermin of the underworld, he is the Spectre, awesome avenger of evil. An earthbound ghost who punishes evil with a fearsome vengeance from beyond the grave. Read on if you dare about the voice that doomed the Spectre."
We should probably point out there's a big scream happening as well. We get the credits for the issue along the bottom.
A DC quality magazine. Script, Michael Fleischer. Art, Jim Aparo. Editor, Joe Orlando.
There is a caption which starts things off at the top of page 2.
"It is mid-morning at the downtown branch of a New York bank. The attractive young lady at the teller's counter is Gwendolyn Sterling. She is about to make a deposit."
Yes, we see Gwen in the outfit that Steve's already described, talking to an older lady behind the counter. In the foreground, we can also see what's clearly Lieutenant Columbo, is played by Peter Falk.
Yes, indeed.
I've been wanting to highlight that for like 2 years, ever since I right-clicked on this page and found the original artwork for this page and right-clicked to save it on my phone to post as bonus content. It's definitely him, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And he seems to be saying just one more thing to the smiling man with the moustache and the stripy hat that he's talking to. But anyway, that's a story for another time. So, Gwen speaks to the bank teller and she says,
"How are you today, Susan?"
"Oh, just great, Miss Sterling. It's such a gorgeous day outside." Suddenly, bursting into the bank are three figures in overalls, which have a sort of logo on the front. It's not too clear from this panel. It looks like a little squiggling hydra to my ancient eyes. They've all got sort of stocking masks on, obscuring their features. One of them's carrying a large satchel, obviously, because, this is a bank. He wants to get some cash. They're all bearing guns. A caption tells us,
"And these people, in case you haven't been reading the newspapers lately, are members of the Symbiosis Liberation Army. They are about to make a withdrawal."
The lead figure points a gun in Gwen's direction and says, "Everybody freeze! You're about to experience one of the nightmares of banking. An older woman with grey hair next to Gwen gasps, and then the second interloper says,
Just throw all the money in the canvas bag and no one will get hurt.
A gentleman in a blue suit with kind of red hair and glasses steps forward in the next panel, and one of the goons says,
You the manager?
To which the poor unfortunate bank manager says,
Yes,
And he's cut off because the gunman fires at him with his machine gun. Brat-a-tat-a-tat. Oh gosh, awful. Picking up on what the gunman said a second ago, the first member of the Symbiosis Liberation Army says, Better make that almost no one. So obviously someone's got hurt. That's terrible. Gwen is appalled at this.
You murdered him in cold blood.
Bank managers are members of the fascist old guard and must be liquidated without mercy, says the first of the baddies. The chap carrying the money bag appears back on the scene, saying,
I got all the money in the teller's cages. Looks like 30 or 40,000.
Then let's split. We'll take her with us. With that, the figure grabs hold of Gwen. They all move towards the door. You can see the one with the bag of money, the third one who hasn't spoken yet, and the leaner, taller one at the front, pointing the gun back at the room, says, It's obvious her bourgeois education has left her sadly lacking in anti-capitalist political awareness. Besides, she'll come in handy as a shield if the decadent capitalist police attempt to apprehend us. They've all left the bank in the next panel, obviously making their way towards their getaway vehicle. And the third bad guy, who hasn't spoken yet, turns and fires his machine gun back into the bank, saying, Power to the people!
But inside the bank, one of the tellers has activated a silent police alarm. And within seconds...
Yes, within seconds, Jim Corrigan has arrived on the scene. Lieutenant Jim Corrigan, looking very dapper in a green suit and a green striped shirt and an enormous black and white striped tie. The bad guys scree off as they roar off in their car, and Jim, waving his pistol, says to no one in particular, Terrorists! And they've got Gwen! The next panel's fantastic. He grows sort of translucent and fades out, thinking, Better not try to tangle with them here. Much better to follow and confront them later as the Spectre. We see the Spectre flying overhead above the getaway car. Fantastic. We arrive at the top of page 4. The caption says,
Presently...
And we're inside the HQ, the hideout of the Symbiosis Liberation Army. I can't believe we haven't made a Symbiosis Liberation Army supported menswear joke yet, but not to worry. So what we see in this panel, Gwen tied at the wrist, tied at the ankles, lying on the ground. There's a discarded, obviously a tin of beans or something lying on the floor beside her, which is awful. It's a very rough looking apartment. We can see the plaster is cracked. We can see that it's very basic in its detailing. We should draw attention to the fact that hanging from the ceiling in the right hand corner of the room is a large sheet which appears to have printed on it a painting of a giant three-headed snake. Now, if you remember the splash panel, you're probably going to think that's going to come in very handy in a moment, but Gwen is looking up at the three of them. They've all taken their masks off, and we can see that the leader is a blonde woman who looks very angry. The guy who was carrying the money bag has got kind of dark red hair. He looks a little bit older than her. And there's a black guy with a moustache who was obviously the third member of the group, still pointing the machine gun at Gwen. Gwen is saying,
How long are you going to keep me here?
The blonde lady replies, Shut up, Carter. Open up the bag. See how much we got. In the background, Carter says,
Right.
And then with a zip, he opens the bag, saying,
You know what's funny? When we liberate currency from a bank in order to carry on the war against fascism, that's called a holdup. But when the president's henchmen break into a doctor's office, that's called a...
And he breaks off because we see the Spectre forming up out of the cash bag. Carter looks up and yells,
Who are you?
I am the Spectre. And with that, the three members of the Symbiosis Liberation Army all fire on the Spectre with their machine guns. Carter says,
I don't know how you managed to curl up inside that bag, Spectre, but it's your funeral.
To which the Spectre, sadly, it seems, thinks to himself, I never had a funeral. Gosh, oh, poor Spectre. In the foreground, the black man is firing his gun as well, and he notices the bullets. They're going right through him. In the first panel of page 5, we see the Spectre hovering in the air as he continues to think to himself, I don't even have a grave to call my own. It is ironic that although your lives are mockeries of the very meaning of humanity, even you shall enjoy the eternal rest that has been denied to the Spectre. And with that, the three-headed snake, the image of it that was on the sheet hanging from the wall, well, the three-headed snake has sort of emerged from the painting and is coiling its way towards the three bad guys. Carter yells,
Look!
And the black guy gasps as the snakes grab a hold of them, and in the second panel they all yell, "Ah!" as they are coiled up and throttled and squashed and crushed and killed by the giant snakes. Tremendous.
For a moment, the room seems to stand suspended in time, frozen there by the awful hissing of the serpent and the piteous shrieking of its victims. And then...
we see Jim Corrigan releasing Gwen from her ropes, saying, "It's all right, Gwen. I'll have you free in a minute."
"Oh, Jim, thank heaven you're here."
In the next panel, we see that Gwen has stood up. She's feeling a little bit better. We can see the dead bodies of the army lying on the ground around them. Gwen and Jim embrace, and she says,
"Oh, hold me, Jim, please. That snake, it was horrible."
"Come on, Gwen. I'm going to get their car and drive you home."
And so...
yep, see the car speeding along. From inside the car, we hear Gwen's voice.
Jim, I don't care if you're a ghost. I love you. I want you to marry me."
Oh, that's a great idea. Nothing I'd rather hear than the pitter-patter of little zombies running around the house.
"Jim, please."
Look, I'm sorry, Gwen, but can't you see what you're asking?
I'm asking to be loved, just like any woman.
Gwen, I am a dead man, a ghost. I don't even breathe, for Pete's sake. Is that what you really want? A husband that has to spend his every waking hour pretending he's alive?
Isn't there any chance you'll ever be alive again?
The next panel, the car pulls up outside the gates of the Sterling estate. Jim replies, "Oh, sure. The boys upstairs have promised to review my case just as soon as I've eradicated all evil from the face of the earth."
"As soon as you've..."
"You heard me right, and from what I've seen of the job so far, I wouldn't advise anybody to try standing on one foot waiting for me to finish it."
Then this is...
"I think it is, Gwen, yes. The way it is now, we are just hurting each other. Believe me, it's better if I just go."
Whatever you say, Jim."
And in the final panel of page 6, Corrigan's car pulls off. The silhouetted form of Gwen watches them go as she thinks sadly to herself,
I'll never forget you."
Never Forget, of course, being the number one single. We'll take that from the summer 1995. But anyway, we arrive at the top of page 7.
That night, in the quiet of his apartment, a tormented Jim Corrigan restlessly paces the floor.
Yeah, this is a great shot of Jim's incredibly hella 70s looking apartment. Everything's brown. The carpet, the cushions, the chairs, the couch, the table. As Steve said, Jim is pacing restlessly, and he's got a cigarette in his gob, because obviously, and he's thinking, "I can't go on this way. I can't. Other men have wives and families. They get to experience the joy and pains of life. And when they die, they are granted the everlasting peace of eternal rest." He stabs out his cigarette. "But I have none of those things. I'm not alive or dead. I'm some sort of lifeless thing, doomed to carry out some kind of awful, unearthly vengeance that I can hardly even understand." He crosses to the window, looks out at the city. "Please, release me from my mission. Let me be a real man again. Let me marry the woman I love. Please."
Now Jim Corrigan turns from his window, unaware that somewhere, out beyond the stars, in a domain of golden clouds and radiant light, his anguished plea is about to be answered.
Yes, this panel's definitely going on the socials, listeners. It's a wonderful sort of blend of pink and orange and yellow. We're going to have a look and see how this was recoloured in Wrath of the Spectre to see if they completely ruined the subtleties. Yes, we see a twinkling of stars and shapes of different sizes, and an echoing voice seems to be saying,
"When you awaken, Jim Corrigan, the humanity you thirst for shall once again be yours. Perhaps the mission I gave you is indeed beyond the fulfillment of any one man. Perhaps being alive again will bring you happiness. I hope so."
Interesting.
And so, the following morning...
You can see Jim having breakfast. There's a toaster in front of him. Is that the first toaster? No, it's not, because the Atom did a trick with a toaster ages ago. From now on, listeners, we'll take a drink anytime we see a toaster. Jim's always having his morning coffee. He's thinking to himself, "I feel so peculiar this morning. It's as if..." But he's interrupted by a bring. And he thinks, uh-oh, the phone. We cut to a smoke-filled police office, and Jim's boss on the other end of the line is saying,
"Jim, this is Captain Stanley. A couple of our men have got Nick Shawn cornered in a tenement on Broome Street."
"Nick Shawn? I know him. He does rub-outs for the Ducky McLaren gang."
"Exactly. I know you've been trying to nail McLaren and his boys. so I figured I ought to let you handle this one.
You see Jim putting on his jacket, and I must draw attention to his horrendous brown check trousers that he's wearing. Look at the sort of thing my Uncle Ian would have worn to play golf in the 1980s. I must send him a photograph of this panel. Anyway, Jim's putting on his jacket and he's saying, "Thanks, I'll get right over there."
Jim, you be careful. He's well armed, and they don't call him Tricky Nicky for nothing.
There's a slow dissolve, a caption reads.
Minutes later...
And Corrigan is still apparently driving the car that belonged to the Symbiosis Liberation Army.
He stole their car. That's hilarious.
What's all that about? What kind of example is that he's setting? Corrigan pulls up. A couple of uniformed policemen. The first one speaks, saying, "He's hauled up in the third-story window, Lieutenant." The second cop says,
"We cleared the block, and we've got sharpshooters on the roofs. But he's got a pistol and a rifle, and he's keeping us pinned down pretty good."
Corrigan says, "Have you tried putting tear gas in there?"
"Won't work, Lieutenant. The gas canisters keep bouncing off the window grill."
"Is there any way to get in through the back?"
"Negative, Lieutenant. He's got the door to the place bolted tight. Only way in is up the fire escape. We'll have to... Hey, where are you going?"
"Up the fire escape. Cover me."
"Lieutenant, don't! You'll get yourself killed!"
The cop shouts after him, and then the other cop, who's still there, says, "You can't talk sense to that guy Corrigan. I swear, there's something weird about him." The first panel of page 9. See Jim starting to grab hold of the ladder to pull himself up onto the fire escape, and he's thinking, his bullets can't hurt me. Later I'll say I was wearing a bulletproof vest or something. Panel 2. I love this page. This favourite page in the whole story, actually. It's beautifully rendered. Panel 2, we're inside the room where Nick Shawn is hiding. We can see Jim making his way up the fire escape, and Nick thinks,
"That copper coming right up the fire escape. He must be out of his tree. But I'll wait till he gets up real close before I nail him. Inflation's been driving up the price of bullets something awful."
Fantastic. Panel 3 is great. We see Jim making his way closer and closer, and in panel 4 he's just outside the window when he says, "Okay, Nicky, throw down your guns and put your hands," but he's cut off as Nicky Shawn fires, blam, 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 saying,
"I think my hearing aid battery must be running low on me, copper. What'd you say?"
"Ugh!" exclaims Jim. He manages to get off one shot of his own before he notices, I'm hit, but bleeding. But that's impossible."
As the gangster's bullets tear into his chest and shoulder, Jim Corrigan reels backward against the wrought iron railing and topples like a rag doll into the street.
Fantastic, yeah. We see this great shot of overhead as Jim falls back over the fire escape, plummeting down towards the rubbish at the bottom. I can see a garbage can, so listeners, you may as well take a drink. One of the policemen sees him falling and yells,
"He got the lieutenant! Quick! Somebody radio for an ambulance!"
And there's a slow dissolve.
Soon,
We see an ambulance has arrived, various ambulance men and police standing around, and we see Corrigan being lifted into the back of the ambulance. As one medic guy, we can see the stethoscope around his neck, says,
"Easy with him now. This man's got 3 bullets in him and he's lost a lot of blood."
The first panel of page 10 is an overhead shot of the ambulance wheeling through the city streets. From inside, we hear a couple of voices. The first one says,
"Is he gonna make it?"
"I don't know," replies his colleague.
For a week, Jim Corrigan hovers between life and death. But finally...
Yes, we can see Jim in his hospital bed. He's sitting up, looks fairly awake, and there's a very matronly-looking nurse standing in the doorway to his room, and she says, "You're well enough to have your first visitor, Lieutenant Corrigan. He's waiting outside now." Jim says, "I'll bet he's an angry little man with a balding head and a black moustache." "Ha! Why, yes, that's right. How did—" And Corrigan's boss bursts into the room, the captain saying,
"So there you are, lunkhead. The doctor tells me you're going to survive in spite of your best efforts to commit suicide. Just what do you think you are, anyway, immortal? Your shot killed Shawn. He's dead. And let me tell you something, Jim. You came awfully damn close to becoming a ghost yourself."
"Me? A ghost? Believe me, Captain, I haven't felt this alive in years." Wow! We are continuing the 5th page following. We pass a full page advertisement for some DC tabloid editions. We pass a full 2-page advertisement for the DC tabloid edition of Stories from the Bible, which I've got. Might post that on the socials. There's also, down underneath it, an advert for the reprint of All-Star Comics number 3, and we don't need to tell you what that comic is important for. We then pass another full-page DC House advert, which features the Joker, Justice Incorporated, Claw the Unconquered, and Tales of Ghost Castle. It also makes mention of Beowulf the Dragon Slayer and Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter. And how many of those titles will we be reading from on the podcast? Listeners, you'll just have to wait and find out. The top of page 11.
A few days later...
Yes, we see Gwen Sterling in her pink bikini with black polka dots looking damn sexy. Gwen's standing, it's a beautiful day, the sun is splitting the skies, and she's thinking,
It's been almost 2 full weeks since I've seen Jim. I miss him so much. But I promised myself I'd...
And her thoughts are interrupted by a voice off camera who says, Hey, good looking, you gonna go swimming in that huge pool all by yourself?
Jim? Oh, wow, am I... Your arm, what happened to...
And we see that Jim's right arm is in a sling. He's wearing a black polo neck right now, listeners. It's the opposite of those check trousers. He looks phenomenal. Wounded no line of duty. Happened to us cops all the time. What's the matter? Don't you ever watch TV?
But I thought you couldn't be wounded. I thought...
And Jim reaches up and grabs Gwen's chin and says, You sure talk a lot. How'd you like to get married next Tuesday?
Do you mean that?
Look, you gonna marry me or not? I'm a busy man. I haven't got all... And he breaks off as, surrounded by flowers. Gwen has a very lush garden, remember. She reaches up and kisses him, pulling him close.
Several days later, in a sleazy waterfront hideout.
We see a thick-set, thick-eyebrowed, dark-haired man in a dark suit sitting behind a desk. Some goons around him. There's a dark-haired guy with a beard, another guy with a hat. He seems to be using a sharp knife to clean out his fingernails. I like that. And there's another guy in a blue suit who's burst in, carrying a newspaper, who says, Hey, Ducky, you know that hero cop Corrigan who nailed Nicky a few weeks back? It says here he's getting married next week.
Is that so? I better ask my duck about that.
And at that, Ducky points towards a rubber duck, which is on his desk. He picks it up for the final panel as the goon who just entered the room says, What's he saying, Ducky?
He says Corrigan ain't gonna live long enough to marry nobody. And you know my duck, right, boys?
And he squeezes the toy duck, and it quacks. And off camera, another one of his goons says,
Yeah, Ducky, we know. He ain't never wrong about nothing.
And events are rounded out with a caption which reads,
To be continued.
Well then, that didn't waste any time, did it?
No, it seems like there was never a wasted moment. It was just boom, boom, boom all the way through. Just very pacey and quick.
Yeah, a lot going on. And it's interesting they were getting this cliffhanger after this quite major shift in Jim Corrigan's status quo. He's been brought back to life. Interesting. How do we think this is going to go, listeners? I like the Death by Snake poster illustration.
I did too. I did kind of feel, we talked about this last time that we spoke, that it is starting to get predictable. The second you see that flag in the background, you're like, wonder what's going to happen there. But it's still gruesome and cool, so you're like, I'll run with it.
Gruesome and cool is a really good way of describing the whole series, actually. I like that. And I suppose the cover's actually reasonably accurate. That could, I suppose now that we look at it, that could be Carter firing his gun in isolation at the Spectre. That's pretty cool. Listeners, I'll tell you now that I have one foreign reprint of Adventure Comics 439, and that's the last foreign reprint I have for this run. It's the last one I've been able to track down. It appears to be the last one, because we're, of course, reaching the end of the Spectre's run in Adventure Comics. Issue 440, which we'll get to in a second, is indeed the final chapter. So it's quite interesting getting that cliffhanger. Given that we know it's coming to the end of the series, it definitely feels like it's part one of a season finale, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely. And a lot of setup of how are things going to be resolved in the final part of said season finale. You know, overall, it's a pretty straightforward caper, Spectre saves somebody kind of story. Even the page layouts are pretty straightforward. It does feel like they're running out of gas maybe a little bit here at the end. But still not bad in any way. Just, a little bit more straightforward than some of the other installments, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say that's all fair. As you said, it's a very straightforward wham-bam story, so there's no real need to experiment with awkward panel layouts or anything like that. All the kind of spooky stuff is dealt with in the opening pages, which is quite unusual. Normally we build up to the weird death. The next issue's weird death is amazing. Spoilers. But yeah, it's really, really good. I like the little development of Jim and Gwen's relationship that we see here. It's not little, it's quite a major sort of step. They're getting married. Will they make it to the altar? I don't know, do we want to spend any much more time on this one? I don't think we really have to. I think we should jump to the contemporary correspondence and then rattle on with part two so as not to keep the listeners in suspense. Listeners, quickly I'm going to read about the text page from issue 441. I think we did the letter from it previously because I remember the editorial response about Dead Man getting his own comic and how we said that didn't happen. I don't think we read the text part out because at that point it was a spoiler, but because we know now we're at the end of the series, I think it's safe to read it. Surprise! Bet you weren't expecting to see Aquaman replace the Spectre as the star of Adventure Comics? Well, to tell the truth, neither were we. The way our business department explains it to us, the Spectre just never made it. Sales in its first few issues were fairly good, but then they trailed off into the dust. And if this mag was the Spectre instead of Adventure Comics, this issue would never have made the stands. But luckily this mag is called Adventure Comics, and that means we can wipe our slate clean, start all over again with a new star. The reason for choosing Aquaman is the best possible. You demanded it. The 3 short backups we ran inspired a flood of favourable comments, so we decided he was our best bet to perk up Adventure. And of course, as I've already established, Aquaman has the headline in Adventure Comics for quite a while. The next year or so, he gets his own book back, and Superboy takes over, and then the dollar comics arrive and everything goes crazy. But we'll get to all that before too long. So we now move to the letters column of issue 442. The first letter goes like this.
Dear Joe, The Spectre is the only DC superhero series with 3-dimensional, well-rounded characters with continuously developing as opposed to developed personalities. And these are the qualities which give each episode variety within a formulated structure. The voice that doomed the Spectre introduced a new angle into the series. What would happen if Corrigan attained the mortality he's been pining for ever since his resurrection? Although I'm sure things will be back to normal by next issue, it would be nice if he could stretch it out a bit. Give Jim, and Mike, a sporting chance. I do have reservations about Gwen's sanity. More accurately, her lack of same. She's got to be a psycho at worst, a masochist at best. After being witness to the slaughter of men by creatures as primally fearsome as snakes, she subsequently rushes to the perpetrator of the horror of all people and asks him to marry her? It's my opinion that Gwen Sterling's mind is about as well-balanced as Superman standing on a kryptonite boulder.
That's good.
Adventure Comics is one of the few DC series I look forward to, and issues like 439 remind me why. And that letter is from Joe Rusnak, Montville, New Jersey.
Editorial response to Joe reads, had the series lived 2 or 3 more issues, you would have seen the first meeting between Gwen and Earl Crawford, and we wonder what you would have thought then. Ah well, the best laid plans, and so forth. Open brackets. By the way, we won't argue Gwen's sanity or insanity with you, but we feel bound to point out that Gwen was more likely to look on Corrigan as her rescuer than a horror. And that's very interesting, what they're saying there about the first meeting between Gwen and Earl Crawford, because, what are we going to do next week, listeners? Well, we'll get to that in a sec. Well, maybe a bit longer than a sec. Anyway, the second letter goes like this. Dear Joe, the voice that doomed the Spectre was a tightly plotted masterpiece, fitted to a core of human emotions, or inhuman emotions, I guess we must call them, since for the first time since the Spectre began appearing in Adventure, he's begun to show his own feelings towards his role as Ghostly Avenger. So the Spectre would like eternal rest. I think he deserves it, but I certainly don't want to see his series discontinued again. Rumour has it that he will soon depart these comic pages to be replaced by Aquaman. Now, I can't complain, since the King of the Seas is one of my favourite heroes, and I'm glad to see Aquaman get a regular berth of his own. Quite obviously, the story serialised in Adventure 439 to 440 is going to closely parallel the Spectre's origin story of 30 years ago. The stage is set with Jim Corrigan, immortal once more, now engaged to the lovely Gwen Sterling and the object of some gangster's malicious intents. This is how it was back in the golden age of comics, and while I hope the adventure will set the stage for a whole bunch of new Spectre stories, I don't want the Corrigan-Sterling engagement marred by tragedy any longer. And that's from prolific letter writer Scott Gibson, Evergreen, Colorado.
I think that's a great point that it raises, that in a way, what this final storyline is doing is a reset. Like, let's get back to the original status quo for the Spectre. I like that it's saying that. I hadn't really considered that. But now I'll move on to the editorial response. Michael's one of the true scholars of the Golden Age material, so it's only natural that he went back to the Spectre's origin for inspiration. But we think he added something more to the myths. And speaking of his scholarly abilities, keep an eye peeled for the first volume of The Encyclopedia of Great Comic Book Heroes, coming this fall from Macmillan Publishing. It's the culmination of years of Michael's research, and we think all comic fans will enjoy it.
Interesting. Do I have that? It rings a bell. I'm going to have to do some digging about, listeners. Right, we come to the final letter. Dear Joe, I was really shocked upon reading Adventure 439's lead story. Technically, it was a little sloppy, but artistically Michael Fleischer has finally proven himself capable of something beyond formula writing. The technical problem I mentioned was Fleischer's concentration on the terrorists, but I suppose I shouldn't complain since after reading his other Spectral tales, I suppose the SLA could have taken up the whole story. I'm glad they didn't. I'm not sure what point this guy's making here, but anyway, we continue. I was impressed by the steps taken with Jim Corrigan. I'd been asking for more development of something between him and Gwen, but I never thought I'd get it. On page 7, the being which responded to Jim's plea was undoubtedly God, though there was a Golden Age Spectre story wherein the ghost discussed his problems with God and disembodied thought balloons were used for his words, his with a capital H. I was still impressed with the tactful way it was handled. Oh, a word for those who were upset by God's admission that perhaps the mission I gave you is indeed beyond the fulfilment of any one man. You'll get letters saying that he isn't capable of a mistake. It's not, however, a mistake as such, just a trial for Corrigan. And there are plenty of examples in the Bible wherein God changed his mind, and if Corrigan's plea can be considered a prayer, then the whole thing is merely the answer to a prayer. The last few pages were done nicely. I'd like to see Jim and Gwen wed. Since the Spectre series is almost kaput anyway, it's better than leaving it hanging, and it make a nice contrast between the demise of the Spectres of Earth 1 and 2. One died cosmically so that the universe could live, and one died humanely so that Jim Corrigan could live. I doubt it'll turn out that way, but it would be nice, and that's from Bob Rhodey, Oak Brook, Illinois.
And the editor says, we might have ended the series that way if we'd had more warning of its demise, but at least this way there's a promise of more to come someday.
That is a wonderful tease, for which we should now move on to issue 440. So Adventure Comics 440, which was published on the 29th of April 1975, and Steve's going to tell you about the cover.
Again, we have up at the top left the line of DC Superstars logo, and in the top right, 25 cents, number 440, August. In between the two, in a yellow banner, Adventure Comics written in red. It says Adventure Comics Presents, and then in a giant logo across the top, it says The Spectre, which I have to say I find kind of interesting that they're canceling the Spectre feature in the book, but they make the Spectre logo so huge rather than Adventure Comics.
Yeah, it's bizarre that they've done it at the final issue. I mean, you think they would have done it all the way along, because it's always been Adventure Comics or Weird Adventure Comics with no actual Spectre logo at all. So finally, in issue 440, his final chapter of this little run, to finally give him the emphasis that he's probably needed all along, it's bizarre, quite frankly. You know, the Adventure Comics logo is a fraction of the size of what it was in 439. Put them side by side and it's ridiculous. You'll see that, of course, listeners, because we'll have posted them side by side in the socials. Yeah, it boggles the mind, quite frankly. But now that we've debated the logo, Steve can now tell you about the striking cover illustration.
Yeah, this is a great cover. Definitely would be one that would make me want to pick up the book. We have a convertible car driving away from us, the reader. And in the back seat of the convertible car are two gangsters wielding machine guns and firing wildly at whatever it is that is following them. They have huge devilish grins on their face. The gangster who is on our left is wearing a brown leather jacket and a white shirt, and the gangster on the right is wearing a lighter brown suit with a big gray tie flowing in the wind, and they're both wearing these devilish, again, expressions on their face as they fire happily, merrily, wanting to destroy whatever it is that's behind them, not knowing that in the front seat of said convertible, the driver of the car is panicked and freaking out. He's throwing his hands up from the wheel in shock and horror because the car is careening forward into the materialized form of the Spectre. He is giant and standing in the roadway, and we can't even see the roadway because all his cape is just filling the page in just this beautiful image. And his right hand is looming forward to the car. And it seems as if it's growing in size to reach forward at the car and grab them. And I can only imagine being the driver of this car and seeing such a sight. I think that is how I would react too. Was like, whoa!
Steve doing a great job there, listeners, of miming both the driver panicking and the Spectre's hand looming forward, all for the benefit of our YouTube viewers, so be sure to check that out. Yeah, it's a great cover, isn't it? It's definitely one of the best. Very simple and effective. It's a weird one. I've always thought of this as the Joyriding Teens cover. But obviously, when you actually look at it, they're not teens at all. So now that we've had a really good laugh about the cover, let's dive straight into the story. The opening splash image is very, very arresting. A crescent moon looms in the background as the Spectre looms further towards us, and we can see a gravestone. Bursting out of the ground in front of the gravestone is someone's hand. The gravestone has a caption written on it.
In the world of mortal men, he is Jim Corrigan, hard-boiled police detective. But to the vermin of the underworld, he is the Spectre, awesome avenger of evil, an earthbound ghost who punishes evil with a fearsome vengeance from beyond the grave.
And we are given the story of this final chapter of the Adventure Comics saga of the Spectre, and that title is
The Second Death of the Spectre.
And we get the credits for the issue.
Script Michael Fleischer, editor Joe Orlando, and the image is signed as Jim Aparo, but he's not actually credited as the artist, but yeah. We get it. We get that.
We do indeed. So, the story begins properly at the top of page 2 with a scene-setting caption.
After being transformed back into an ordinary human being once again, Lieutenant Jim Corrigan was seriously wounded in a shootout with a member of the notorious Ducky McLaren gang. Now, after almost 2 weeks in the hospital, he has returned to work.
It's worth pointing out, of course, that the Ducky McLaren gang supported the Montrose Avenue at the Bristol Fleece and Firkin in October 1998, but that's beside the point. We see Jim exiting police headquarters, looking very smart in a green suit, and there's a chestnut seller at the bottom of the stairs. We don't get them very often in the UK. I don't know how common they are in the States, but anyway, Jim is thinking to himself, and tomorrow morning I'm marrying Gwen. I'm sick and tired of... But his thoughts are interrupted as the chestnut seller yells up to him,
Chestnuts, Lieutenant? I got some real hot ones.
Sure, Louis, I'll take a bag.
These'll cost you a sawbuck, Lieutenant.
And with that, Jim flicks a coin at Louis, the chestnut seller. What's a sawbuck? I don't know. The next panel, Jim is about to tuck into his bag of chestnuts and he replies, For $10, they better be really tasty, Louis.
Oh, they are, Lieutenant. Ducky McLaren and his boys are sick of hiding out. They're ready to turn themselves in.
Jim, examining a chestnut closely, in the next panel says, You're full of it, Louis.
This tip's good as gold, Lieutenant. I mean it. But they won't surrender to nobody but you. They don't trust no other cop but you.
Corrigan walks off saying, I'm touched all right, Louis. Where and when?
Tonight, 10 o'clock. The old carousel out at Coney Island. You gonna be there, Lieutenant?
Nope, says Jim as he walks off. There's a slow dissolve.
That night.
And beautifully rendered here. This is some of the best art I've ever seen since we started doing the podcast. We see Corrigan. He might still be driving that stolen car from the previous issue, but he's arrived at Coney Island at night, and it's gorgeous and dark and moody, and we can see the carousel and the roller coaster and the silhouettes of all the other rides, and he's leaning against his car and he's thinking, that Louis given me lots of good tips, but I don't know about this one. Anyway, I better be careful, because I'm not the Spectre anymore, so if it's a trap I won't be able to look at them funny and turn them all into cottage cheese. With that, Jim is obviously startled, he's heard something, he pulls his pistol, because arriving in the scene is a gentleman with dark hair and a thick dark beard, wearing a brown blouse-style leather jacket and brown trousers. He looks very similar to one of the guys that was in Ducky's office a few minutes ago. This new arrival proclaims,
Take it easy, Corrigan. You ain't gonna need that. We're surrendering, honest. Don't you trust anybody?
Corrigan, still with his pistol pulled, says, No, so keep those hands up, or I'll install a second Holland tunnel inside your head. The guy's turned away from him now. Jim has his gun to his back. Jim continues in the next panel, saying, All right, Mitch, where's Ducky and the others?
Over there, right behind the...
But he's interrupted as a voice yells,
Right over here, Corrigan.
Then come out with your... What? Says Jim, and he breaks off because a sudden blinding light shining on both him and Mitch. It looks like they've been caught in the headlights of a car or something. And again the voice off camera says,
You're a dead man, Corrigan.
Corrigan grabs Mitch by the throat the next panel, put his arm round his neck, pulling him in front of him, using him as a shield, and he says, Not unless you want Mitch to be dead too, Ducky.
Ugh, you're choking me,
exclaims Mitch. We then see in the next panel that it looks like two cars are shining their headlights towards Jim and Mitch as we hear once again Ducky saying,
Okay, Corrigan, have it your way.
And that prompts Mitch to say,
Hey, what does that mean, have it your...
And then they're both cut off as we see the rat-a-tat-a-tat sound effect and the firing of machine guns, and both Mitch and Jim are caught in a hail of bullets. Final panel on page 4, we see 4 silhouetted figures standing over them. One guy with a hat, a couple of others shining torches, and on the far right with a very elaborate cigarette in his gob. Clearly that's Ducky. The first man, one in the hat, speaks and says, "We got him, Ducky. He's deader than last year's Limburger." One of the others says,
"Too bad about Mitch."
And Ducky remarks,
That's how it goes in the gangsta biz. Win a few, lose a few.
In the next panel, we seem to have relocated because we see Ducky and his pal standing quite near Louis, the chestnut seller. Louis is saying,
Hey, Ducky, I did just like you said. You gonna give me my payoff now?
Ducky, with his cigarette holder in his mouth, looks to his pal Muggsy and says,
Pay him off, will you, Muggsy?
"Sure, Ducky," says Muggsy, pulling a gun. Louis looks a little panicked here. He says,
Hey, wait a minute. That ain't fair. You said... Gah!
and he's interrupted with another rat-a-tat-tat as Muggsy fires a machine gun right at him. Poor Louis, we hardly knew him. In the next panel, we see Ducky with his rubber duck in his hand, still with a cigarette in his mouth, and he says,
Dump the vendor, then stuff Corrigan in the car. My rubber duck just come up with an idea that ought to be good for 1,000,000 laughs.
And the other goon is standing nearby remarks,
"Okay, Ducky."
There's a slow dissolve.
Meanwhile,
And we see the glamorous, ridiculous Gwen Sterling posing in a mirror, looking at her own reflection in a very short, flowery dress, and she thinks to herself,
I've got to admit, I look fantastic. If I were a man, I'd sure feel like...
but thankfully she's interrupted with a bing bong, and she thinks,
Now who could that be?
Saved by the Bell, quite frankly, listeners. Saved from the dark thoughts of Gwen Sterling. Gwen approaches the door on the first panel of page 6, and she's thinking,
Oh my gosh, what if it's Jim? It's bad luck for the groom to see the bride in her outfit before the...
that's her wedding dress, good grief. In panel 2, she opens the door,
Jim? What's the...
and we see Corrigan is leaning against the door, wide-eyed, and a little sign hanging on a string has been hung around his neck, and it reads, "I was a pesky cop. I got what I deserved." And Gwen screams as Corrigan's lifeless body falls down on the ground, and she's then seen sobbing into his chest as she cradles and hugs his dead body. That's a very 70s wedding dress, Gwen, it must be said. Anyway, not to be disrespectful, there is another slow dissolve and another caption.
a few days later, they buried Jim Corrigan. It was a simple, quiet ceremony. Jim Corrigan had been a lonely man. He hadn't had too many friends.
Yes, it looks like a very minimal service. We can see the coffin being lowered into the ground by a couple of groundsmen. We can see Gwen there, what looks like Jim's boss, maybe a couple of other policemen. All very sad. We then arrive at the top of page 7.
Then the people left, and night came. The graves in the cemetery were silent now, as silent as the gentle munching of worms. And then a voice rang out. If you could really call it a voice, it was more like a clap of brittle thunder.
And in the next couple of panels, we hear this voice, which is sort of, speech bubbles are slightly jagged and edged and tinged in gold, and they're saying,
I am calling you, Jim Corrigan. Shake away the soft, moist earth and come to me.
Yeah, we can see in front of the headstone, which reads James Brendan Corrigan, 1940 to 1975, which we will come back to. Jim's right hand breaks the surface of the recently filled in grave. Panel 3, we see him emerging fully from the ground, and then he stands up, dusting the earth from his clothes. A full moon looms in the background.
Time seemed to stand still. Perhaps it did stand still, as the ghost of Jim Corrigan sped heavenward on a radiant shaft of unearthly light.
And that's what we see. We're back in that sort of luminous orangey, pink and yellow sky that we saw in the last issue. And it's been dissected by a shaft of brilliant white light, and Corrigan is flying up through it.
Until finally it had reached the most awesome destination of all.
And we see the ghost of Jim Corrigan again standing in front of the twinkly, sparkly, starlight lights. And a voice says,
You may speak, Jim Corrigan.
Why have I been brought here? Why have I been torn from my grave to...
No man can escape his destiny. And your destiny is to remain earthbound, to strike at evil with the fearsome vengeance of the hereafter, as the Spectre.
Wide-eyed Jim's ghost says, What do I care about vengeance? It's eternal rest I want. Can't you understand that? Haven't I earned it? Haven't I?
Jim Corrigan pleaded, but he pleaded in vain. and suddenly the ghost of the slain detective could feel itself being pulled earthward by some inexorable force. Down, down.
Yeah, and we see Jim descending back through the shaft of light, the brilliant shaft of white light, and it almost looks like he's put his hands out to try and stop himself.
Back to the cemetery, back inside the coffin, so that only the jagged hole in the soft brown earth stood as eerie testimony to what had happened here.
Yeah, and we see, it must be a groundsman or a caretaker chap in charge of looking after the cemetery, walking along with a torch, shining his light around, and he sees the disturbed earth on the top of Jim's grave, and he thinks,
Why, it looks like somebody forgot to fill in this grave.
He moves forward.
I'd better get me a shovel and...
He breaks off because we can hear a bam, bam, bam.
That banging coming from inside the coffin. No time to get a shovel. Somebody's been buried alive.
The old man ducks down. The bam, bam continues as he starts to dig with his hands.
The old caretaker dug frantically until his fingernails were caked with blood. And finally...
He manages to get the coffin open, and we see Jim Corrigan, who gasps and says, Need air.
Good Lord.
In the first panel of page 9, using his torch, which helpfully is shining directly into Jim's face, he grabs hold of Jim's left hand and starts helping him out of the coffin.
You all right, mister?
Yeah, I just need to be able to breathe for a minute. Jim gets to his feet. The old man says,
You're damn lucky I was passing by when I was. I hate to even think what would have happened if I hadn't heard you. Well, you must have been in a coma or something, and your vital signs probably got so low that the doctor and everybody figured you was dead.
Exactly what I want him to think, Corrigan thinks to himself, and the old man then says,
You come with me. We've got to get you to a...
But he breaks off, shines his torch around. Corrigan seems to have vanished, and he thinks,
What? That fella I just hauled out of that grave, he's gone.
The next panel, the caretaker walks off, shining his torch in front of him, and what he doesn't see but we do see is flying away in the sky above him is the ghostly form of the Spectre. The caretaker thinks,
He must have just rushed off to see his loved ones. Yes, sir, I bet that young fella's mighty glad to be alive.
Meanwhile, in a dingy waterfront hideout, Ducky McLaren and his henchmen while away the hours, blissfully unaware that they are all doomed men.
Yes, and it's clearly a waterfront hideout because we can see rope coiled up and hanging off the walls. Ducky's on the far right of the panel, reading a newspaper with his rubber duck, sat on the table behind him. A couple of other lads are playing cards. In front of us we can see one guy has a few aces and the other guy has at least one ace, so I'm not quite sure what's going on that, but there's two guys. With his back to us is Muggsy. He's taking his hat off. In front of him is his pal Al. Al's smoking a cigarette, and Al is proclaiming his cards to Muggsy so he can see them, and he's saying,
Ha! Read 'em and weep, Muggsy, a full boat.
Muggsy, looking behind Al, sees the familiar figure, to us at least, of the Spectre coming through the wall of the hideout, and he exclaims, Al, look! But in the first panel of page 10, Al doesn't turn round. The Spectre looming behind him, Al says,
What do I look to you, stupid? Last time I let you pull that look routine on me, you swiped $50 out of the...
Al, look!
Come on, Muggsy, don't be a sore...
But please, look, Al! And then finally, Al turns around and starts to fire his gun at the Spectre, saying,
Who are you? What do you want?
I am Lieutenant James Brendan Corrigan, and what I want is vengeance.
Corrigan, eh? Well, he's dead. And it just so happens I don't believe in spooks.
In the foreground of the panel, looking very panicked, Muggsy says, Oh, I believe in him. I'm getting out of here. And one of their guys says,
Me too. Come on, Ducky, run.
The goons all make for the exit, the Spectre looming after them. And in the foreground of the panel, looking very panicked, Ducky, we see him reaching forward as he says,
My duck! I can't leave without my duck!
Pausing in the doorway, Muggsy turns and says, Please, Ducky, we'll buy you another.
No, it wouldn't be the same.
And then in the final panel of page 10, something odd seems to be happening to Ducky's mascot. It's surrounded by a golden aura, as Ducky says,
My duck! What have you done to it? Why is it glowing like that?
Listeners, Steve and I have covered an awful lot of bizarre deaths over the last few months as we've done this comic. And we're now, well, If you think some of them have been bad, if you thought the stuffed gorillas or the pit of alligators were bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Top of page 11. The rubber duck has suddenly grown to huge size. It's now like a massive, giant, Food of the Gods style, oversized, real-life duck. The Spectre is standing hovering, watching all of this. The golden glow surrounding both him and the duck. Ducky, the poor soul looking panicked, yells to the Spectre,
Answer me! What have you done to...
but he breaks off as the duck swallows him whole.
Yeah!
Oh my goodness, I'm going to have bad dreams. The Spectre, looking very Neil Adamsy in this panel, thinks to himself, the others think to flee, but even an ant with the whole universe to hide in could not elude the Spectre. And we cut inside the car that the bad guys are using to get away, and we see the Spectre hovering in the sky in front of them. And Al, who's driving, spots him and says,
Look out there on the road. It's him.
How'd he get in front of us so fast? Says Muggsy. And the next panel, an image very closely replicating the cover, we see the car speeding towards the giant form of the Spectre. Al yells,
Good Lord, he's growing.
Run him down, yells Muggsy, but the caption for the next panel reads,
Before the unbelieving eyes of the terrified criminals, the Spectre grows to gigantic size until he towers above the onrushing auto.
And we see this whole sequence reads like very much like something out of a British comic that I would have read as a kid. And we hear the gasps of the bad guys inside as the Spectre reaches down and grabs the car from the road. And indeed, the caption for the final panel of page 11 confirms that, saying,
And then, seizing the car in an iron grip, he hurls it into the stratosphere, where it erupts into flame like a fiery meteor, before hurtling onwards into the trackless void to wander forever among the stars.
In the first panel of page 12, the car can be seen hurtling through the sky, and in the foreground, there's a very nice domestic setting. At the bedroom window, a little boy and his dad, and the little boy says,
Look, Dad, a shooting star.
Make a wish, son. Well, that's quite dark, isn't it? There's a slow dissolve.
Later.
Yep, we're back with poor unfortunate Gwen Sterling, who's must be holding what looks like a photograph of Jim in her hand. She's lying in her bed, she's crying, she's thinking,
Oh, Jim, if only I could hear your voice again. If only...
Hello, Gwen. Gwen turns.
Jim, my darling, is it you? Is it really?
No, Gwen, it's not really me. It's just the spectral shadow of the man I used to be. The world will be told that Jim Corrigan was buried alive by mistake and rescued by an old caretaker, but the truth is that no man can escape his destiny. And my destiny is to be the Spectre. And with that, Jim grows transparent and fades out. Poor Gwen cries,
Jim, don't go. Please don't go.
And as she sits sobbing, she thinks to herself,
Oh, Jim, I'm so alone without you.
And the final panel of the story, the final panel of the series, we see the disturbed grave of James Brendan Corrigan with the Spectre looming above it, and a tiny caption reads,
The end.
Well then,
Whew.
first thing I want to say to get it out of the way is the date of birth on his gravestone,
Yes.
specifying 1940. To me, that suggests these have not been the adventures of the Golden Age Spectre transferred to another Earth. This is definitely a distinct, separate incarnation, if you like.
Right, because, I mean, the reason they chose 1940 was because that was when the Spectre debuted originally, correct?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Around then, anyway, yeah.
But yeah, to have Jim Corrigan be 35 years old in the 70s makes sense for a police detective to be of that age. And so this can't be the Corrigan we knew. This has to be Earth 1 or a separate Earth. And as we've said over and over again, this has to be a separate Earth. Every bit of evidence suggests it's a different place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Ducky being eaten by the giant duck might be my favourite death, actually. I think I said that a minute ago, but I think that has to be just because it's awful. Can you imagine poor Ducky? When I was reading it in preparation, I had no memory of him dying like that, and I just did sort of wonder. I thought, right, are they going to make us something out of this? The Ducky thing, is that going to be involved in his demise?
To earn a nickname like Ducky, to have as your gimmick a rubber duck that you squeeze, you must have loved rubber ducks your entire life. And then to be killed by one. A giant, glowing, very angry one, by the way. The top of page 11, panel 1, where that is an angry duck. That duck is out for blood.
its focus is laser sharp. You can tell, just look at its eyes. Eyes on the prize. It knows what it's doing. It's interesting. Ducky is a slightly outdated term, very outdated term for a gay man. I wonder if he was supposed to be that way inclined, with his cigarette holder and stuff. It's
Interesting. I was not unfamiliar with that.
Yeah, it might have just been something that was used over here. It's interesting. But there's some beautiful art in this story. That as you say, page 11 is probably my favourite page in this issue. The contrast between the glowing giant duck and then swallowing Ducky in silhouette, and then the moody stuff of the Spectre out on the road. Like, I just love the fact that he grabbed the guys and just threw them into space. That's absolutely hilarious.
Get in the sea. That is.
Yeah. Foomf. I don't think it works very well as a conclusion to the whole saga. It works very well as a conclusion to last issue's story. Jim being restored to life and then cut down, and then God, if it is God, having a change of thought about everything that's going on. It works very well organically, I think, as a two-parter. It's very well structured. It's very well put together. It reads almost seamlessly.
I agree. And I just want to mention, as a kind of conclusion to the entire series, it feels very much like Sam Beckett never went home.
Spoilers. Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're saying, because we've had Jim pleading for his rest, and he's been denied that, and he's trapped endlessly still in the service, I think the difference is that Sam is quite happy to keep going.
I agree.
Listeners, I'm about 9 or 10 episodes away from my rewatch of Quantum Leap. So, yes, check me out on the socials the next week and a half when you see me bawling my eyes out on Snapchat because I've just watched Mirror Image again. It's an interesting one. There's some stuff we obviously have to talk about, to recap over the whole sort of series. First of all, I want to mention a couple of points that have been raised on the socials by a couple of listeners. I want to give a quick shout out and hello to Alex Finney, who commented on a couple of our Spectre-related posts on Instagram today, literally moments before we started recording. So, Alex, hello. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed coverage of these issues today. But also, Lynn Savage has posted on Twitter asking, if God created the Spectre, shouldn't every Earth have one? Which is a fair sort of assessment, because if this is all, I think you're sort of saying, if there's a separate God in every universe, does that mean, or is there one God across all universes? Steve looks sceptical. What are your thoughts on that, Steve?
No, I'm not skeptical. I'm pondering, and I think there probably should be one God over all the DC Comics multiverse, creating these spirits of vengeance. As I'm miming dropping specters into all the different universes.
Steve, helpfully miming that for the benefit of our YouTube viewers.
Yeah, and I think that question goes back to then every universe needs a Spectre, and this universe not being one that we have seen before.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what we've seen over the last while is a separate, distinct Spectre on an Earth where Clark Kent is known to be Superman, where Swamp Thing is published as a comic, and where the Daily Bugle is published as a newspaper. But then there's been chat of magic rings and others and people from other planets. So maybe this is a variation of the main DC timeline. And of course, we did meet the Spectre in the pages of Brave and the Bold, where it seemed very clearly to be an Earth 1 Spectre, if you accept that the Batman in Brave and the Bold is the Batman of Earth 1. But it just seems, it becomes increasingly, the more we read of the pages of Brave and the Bold, it seems to be a different Batman of a different universe every issue. But, Lynn Savage also asks, given that if there's one God across the whole multiverse and there's a Spectre on every Earth, what do we think the Spectre of Earth 3 would look like?
Oh.
It's a thought, isn't it?
It is indeed. Perhaps the Spectre of Earth 3 has somehow been imprisoned by the crime syndicate, because you would think the Spectre of Earth 3 he would be busy all the time. There would never be time when he would have a day off, because everybody's evil all the time there. So
yeah, but Earth 3, of course, everything's opposite. So does that mean that the Spectre is a bad guy who goes around punishing the good?
Oh, I like that too.
And he wears, are the colours of his outfit reversed? I don't know. Does he have black skin and wears maybe a red cape or something? I'm going to give, if Jeff Johns is listening to this, he's going to steal that for the next time he eventually gets his finger out and decides to write another JSA series. Coming soon, an episode for Steve and Peter and we get Ross in on it as well. And we all have a moan about the latest Justice Society of America series published by DC Comics. Some stuff we're going to talk about in our next episode, which is going to come up again, some of the stuff that we've seen in this episode. And this is very much clearly presented as sort of as a conclusion to the Jim Corrigan and Gwen Sterling situation. But we've also been in this spot before, where these tried to kill it and and wind things up, and they've gone their separate ways, and we haven't seen her for a few issues. So I'm a bit sort of like but it definitely feels like a conclusion. I mean, the Spectre being sent back down to Earth to keep going with what he'd been doing, and Jim not granted his eternal rest, and that final symbolism of his grave lying open. I think it definitely feels. I said at one point an element of that one reminded me of, there was a British horror comic which didn't last very long in the mid-80s. It was called Scream. Brilliant stuff. It got merged with the Eagle. And the closure of this, it reminded me of how quite often stories in British weeklies would be sort of wound up very quickly, and they would be effective but also a little unsatisfying, a little abrupt often at times. They were generally anthologies, and stories would start, they'd run for a few months, they'd finish, a new strip would start, kind of thing. And it reminded me very much of the ending of, say, House of Demon or Monster, in a way, which you feel that more stories could still be told, but they've just decided to, right, we're putting a full stop here because this strip is finished and we're not doing any more with it. I really feel that, despite what a lot of the letter writers were saying at the time, I think generally, although, as we've said, it was a bit repetitive, I think there was still quite a lot of potential left in this.
I would absolutely agree. And I think the 3 stories that are reprinted in Wrath of Spectre 4 really kind of illustrate that there's more room.
Yeah, listen, we're going to be talking about Wrath of the Spectre in our next episode, but we'll tell you a bit more about that when we get to the end of this one. We don't want to say too much because it might preempt what we end up saying in our next episode.
But I do like what you said about how it kind of comes full circle and ending with the funeral and being kind of a conclusion of sorts. It comes full circle even within this arc.
Yeah.
Because the Spectre was lamenting in the previous issue about, I never got a funeral, in this very kind of Charlie Brownish, melodramatic kind of way, but it also makes sense. And so then he gets to come back to life, but then he sadly gets his wish in an ironic way that he does get a funeral, and it's, pulling the rug out from under him in that way.
That's an excellent point. That's very, very well put. Yeah, you're right. I thought it was odd in 439 when the Spectre lamented the lack of a funeral instead of Corrigan. Maybe Corrigan got one. I'm not sure. Maybe he didn't on this off. No, you're right. That's true. And it points to how well, I think, the conclusion has been executed. I mean, I say it feels a little bit like they could have done more with it, but it doesn't really feel too rushed as a conclusion. The way you've just sort of described it there, the way him lamenting about the funeral, and the way that the pacing of this 2-part story has worked very, very well as a conclusion to the whole thing. It doesn't feel like, I'm trying to think of a bad OMAC, which I read recently, the 70s run of OMAC, the final issue of that is just brutal. It just stops. Kirby's cliffhanger panel is overwritten and they just write something else, and it's very unsatisfying. It gets picked up in a later issue of Commandy, but that's for another show. But I think it works well. It's not too abrupt. And it's all based on the letters page, from all the stuff we've been reading. This is something that they probably started planning almost as soon as they started.
The only other thing that I wanted to mention is just a little humorous moment, and it goes back to on page 9 when Al and Muggsy are playing cards, and Al says that he's got a full boat, but his full boat is made up of, if you look very closely, 5 of the same card, and they're all aces. And Muggsy has an ace in his hand.
Yeah, I noticed that Muggsy had an ace. Now, you know a lot more about gambling and playing cards for money than I do.
A full boat's a full house, and that's 3 of a kind plus a pair.
Right, what does that mean?
3 of the same card and 2 of the same different card, essentially.
Right, so give me an example of that then.
3 kings, 2 queens.
And that's a...
That's a full house or a full boat.
Full house. Okay, right, okay.
And there's only 4 of any one card in a deck. So the fact that he has 5 of them, and the fact that Muggsy has a 6th one.
Yeah.
And then he complains. He has the audacity to complain that Muggsy's going to cheat if he turns around to look. You're going to take money out of the pot that I illegally cheated to win. And I'm hoping you don't notice that I have 5 of the same card in my hand.
Yeah, he definitely has at least 3 aces. I wouldn't say it's completely clear that he's got 5 aces. Listeners, tune in next week as Steve starts his new independent podcast about the accurate representation of card games in DC Comics through the Silver and Bronze Ages of comics. So now jump on quickly to the contemporary correspondence, because we're running long on this one, which we probably expected to do, but stuff happens. There's not a lot of chat about the Spectre in this one. They seem to have missed out his story from 440 completely, but the end of one letter in 443 reads like this. Adventure 441 did have its sad side, though I sincerely hope we continue to see the Spectre, at least in occasional guest shots. The stories, and especially the art, were enjoyable throughout his short run and adventure. Whatever's done, please don't let him fade out of existence. And that's from Mike Christensen, Rockford, Illinois. Lots of letters from Illinois this episode. I hope you're going to go and chase all these people down.
Absolutely.
Tune in next week for Steve's new podcast. He tracks down all the people who wrote letters to DC Comics in the 1970s who came from Illinois. I dare you. I would listen to that. Right, anyway.
Editorial response. Since the Spectre's first revival was edited by Julie Schwartz, and our abortive attempt did no better, we've run out of talent to try on it at the moment, but rest assured, someday some editor will want to try again.
Yes, the Spectre does not really do very much for a long time, it must be said. He is involved in the next JLA, JSA story, features briefly in Showcase 100, but he's not seen for a very, very long time, which is a shame. The next letter has a little bit about the Spectre at the start.
Dear Joe, Adventure 441 will go down in the annals of comicdom as a great turning point issue. Aquaman's popularity and good exposure, of course, made him the only real choice to replace the saccharine, ghostly Spectre. Do you know that the past 5 or 6 Adventure comics have been selling so poorly, and their distribution has been so bad, that even our biggest local comic stores didn't stock them? For this reason, I just about jumped for joy, my next-door neighbor, when I saw Adventure 441 complete with a beautiful new cover and Aquaman as the star. Paul Levitz and Jim Aparo make beautiful comics together. Levitz came up with a whale, pun intended, of a story, giving the reader a flavor of Aquaman's power, while Jim's artwork was really eye-catching. One minor irk, the colors seemed a bit washed out. A better colorist would really give Aparo's artwork pizzazz. One last thing. You mentioned suggestions for the replacement of the Seven Soldiers of Victory serial once their tenure expires. As my natural choice, Deadman, will be getting his own ghostly series soon, I think I'd like to see Hawkman and the Creeper rotated on a 4-month basis. And that letter comes from Buzz Sawyer from West Bloomfield, Michigan.
Editorial response. Regular Aquaman colourist Carl Gafford pleads innocent to the washed-out look and reports that some copies printed weekly for an unknown reason. Weekly, of course, spelled W-A-A-K-L-Y. Judge a man not by a single one of his works. Because it's interesting, because the colouring on Jim's work on the Spectre has been nothing short of spectacular at times. As for the new backup, Hawkman is busy in Detective Comics, but we will consider the Creeper, which many readers have suggested, as soon as sales on his first issue special come in. You ask how we can afford a time-wasting luxury when the Seven Soldiers of Victory concludes this issue? Simple. Next issue is a novel-length Aquaman thriller, blah, 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 blah. Well, listeners, that finishes our discussion, well, not completely finishes our discussion of the Spectre in the pages of Adventure Comics. Join Steve and I next week because we're going to talk about the 80s reprint series, Wrath of the Spectre, issue 4 of which featured 3 stories written by Michael Fleischer and illustrated by Jim Aparo that weren't published because of the cancellation of the Adventure Comics series. We're going to talk about them. We're not going to read them, but we've got detailed summaries. We're going to be discussing them next week. Peter's not here, so I'll do all the spiel. What are your thoughts on the 70s Spectre stories? You can write to us at the earth2podcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at the Earth2 Podcast. We're on Twitter, formerly known as X. The other way around. Podcast_Earth2. If you're feeling generous, you go to wherever it is you receive your podcasts, give us a nice review, or go to our coffee page and buy Peter the price of a beverage. Steve, once again, my friend, thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. It's been a blast. It really has.
It really has. And we're going to go and have a quick drink of water and a bathroom break, and then we're going to get on and record our episode looking at Wrath of the Spectre. So, that's your notice to try and get hold of Wrath of the Spectre issue 4 if you want to read along with us next week. We will see you in 7 days. I've been David.
And I've been Steve.
You've been listening to
The Earth 2 Podcast.
Transmatter Cube activated. Return coordinates set for Earth Prime.
Yeah, it boggles the mind, quite frankly. But anyway, now we've talked about the logo. Pete? No, it's Freudian slip. We see Jim exiting police headquarters, looking very smart in a green suit, and there's a a hot dog seller at the bottom of the stairs. No, it's not. It's chestnuts. Try that again. Oh dear, that's a good start, isn't it? Sorry, Doctor. What's on? Right, I'm going to cough.
These'll cost you a sawbuck, Lieutenant.
What's a sawbuck?
$10.
What? Really?
And I only know that
Bloody
because
hell.
the very next line says that.
Right, smart arse. Yeah, you.